amazing book, Representation and Identity. The whole point of this book is to have you question. Blows my mind. Just Google it.
Hey, I'm Phil, and I'm an Information Master's student at the University of Michigan. I'll also be teaching a communications course that goes over the basic theories and histories in communications, and I'm super pumped about that. So this summer, I decided to learn all about information science, or what I can, and share it with you people. So here is what I'll cover in this video. I'm going to tell you how I found this book and why I chose to read it. I'll also tell you what is in the book and show you some of the key takeaways that I got out of it, as well as do a sticky note exploration where I look through the notes I took and show them to you, things that stood out to me as important that I want to remember or I had a connection to. And then I'll leave you with some closing thoughts. Alright, so first, how I found this book. This book actually happened to be on the shelves of my good buddy David's office. So my friend David has this background where he's going into classrooms, he thinks about ed tech, integration between teaching and learning, and technology. He's really interested in the critiques against and the shortcomings of technology. So he's been reading Cathy O'Neil, Weapons of Math Instruction, and Algorithms of Oppression. So David happens to be my friend, and I saw this book on his shelf, but I'm also drawn to this book because I could go into graduate school and learn how to build beautiful interfaces or do qualitative and quantitative research about how people use and interact with computers, but I wouldn't have to necessarily gain a critical understanding of those tools. The kinds of required courses that are a part of the curriculum for my master's program are things like graphic design, research studies, case studies, and doing actual field work, so working with clients on real-world projects. But none of that gets into what stinks about the kinds of information technology tools out there and the existing systems that we use in everyday life. I wanted to go into grad school and just bump my reading stamina and be able to read more and better, but I also wanted to have some of the background knowledge and research and information on what are the problems in this space. That pretty much covers what drove me to read this book. So these are the contents of the book. You can see there are those 6 chapters: a society searching, searching for black girls, searching for people in communities, searching for protections in search engines, the future of knowledge in the public, and the future of information culture. Finally, the conclusion, algorithms of oppression, and the epilogue. The first sentence in the introduction is, "This book is about the power of algorithms in the age of neoliberalism and the ways those digital decisions reinforce oppressive social relationships and enact new modes of racial profiling, which I have termed technological redlining." Okay, so there's no messing around. We're getting into the heavy stuff. There is one main point, she says, that there is a missing social and human context in some types of algorithmically driven decision making, and this matters for everyone engaging with these types of technologies in everyday life. In chapter 1, she explores the theme of corporate control over public information, and she shows several examples of Google keyword searches and just how terribly awful and horrifying they can be, especially within the context of a black feminist perspective, which she talks about also in the book. In chapter 2, she discusses how Google search reinforces stereotypes, illustrated by searches on a variety of identities that includes black girls, Latinas, and Asian girls. In chapter 3, she examines the importance of non-commercial search engines and information portals. She dedicates chapter 4 to critiquing the field of information studies and foregrounds how these issues of public information through classification projects on the web, such as commercial search, are old problems that we must solve as a scholarly field of researchers and practitioners. And to conclude, she looks at another kind of algorithm-driven app, which is Yelp, and discusses how beyond Google, readers can understand and think about the impact of algorithms, looking at people and how they're represented in other businesses that are seemingly benign transactions, she says. So she also says this is a practical work, and her intention is to influence public policy and promote the interactions between researchers and scholars, people in the humanities, people who are specialists in race studies and feminist studies, gender studies, and how those interact with technology and information studies. So that's an overview of the 6 chapters in Safiya Noble's book, Algorithms of Oppression. Let's look at my sticky notes and see how I actually read this book. Okay, so I wanted to start with her motivation to write the book. On page 17, she talks about 2 instances where she encountered racism in search. In 2009, a friend told her, "You should see what happens when you search black girls on Google." Then, in the spring of 2011, she said she wanted to engage her girls in some conversation about things that they cared about while they were on vacation or having some family time. She was pre-screening what was there online, and she found horrible, racist, pornographic images of black girls when she searched black girls. She says, "I had almost inadvertently exposed them, the girls, to one of the most graphic and overt illustrations of what the advertisers already thought about them. Black girls were still the fodder of porn sites, dehumanizing them as commodities, as products, and as objects of sexual gratification." So she asks this question: for whom, then, was this the best information? In chapter 1, A Society Searching, she brings out this big idea. Google is an advertising company, motivated by profit, not an information NGO. She points out a ton of scholars and academics and professionals in the field, and one of them was Alex Haleyus, who talks about the norming of technology and how companies and society and corporations are able to kind of hide what's going on. She also talks about the goal of what algorithmic literacy really looks like, and that's that every user of a search engine should know how it works. Part of what Safiya Noble does is she shows you a lot of scholars and names and research. So there's a growing movement of scholars, she says. One of the cases that she points out in the book that points toward racism in search engines and algorithms and in this math behind the way these systems work is a journalist who broke news on the story of North Point. The journalist was Julia Angwin. It was about a system, a software that was over-incarcerating black people despite not having any justification or evidence that they would commit more crimes in the future. The system, the data, the math just lumped all of these individuals together and put them in for longer jail time. White people with the same data, the same profiles, would have a less long sentencing or no sentencing at all. She also talks about her use of black feminism as a kind of lens to approach the way search engines work and algorithms. One of the scholars she mentions is Professor of Science and Tech at UCLA, Sandra Herring, who says feminist challenges reveal that the questions that are asked, and more importantly, the questions that are not asked, are at least as determinative of the adequacy of our total picture as are any answers that we can discover. So when we were talking about the family time that she was on and the kinds of things she had seen when she was pre-screening Google search results, and she found images that were highly sexualized, pornographic, and some of the auto-suggestions were things like, why are white women so pretty by comparison when you have, why are black people so loud, why are black women so angry, as the first auto-suggested result. Here you can see another snapshot, which is a really interesting real example of what happens in these search results. When you look at something like the concept of beautiful without including the word woman, you have mostly women, so women are more sexualized than men, for example. And here you have the concept of ugly, which has more men. Here there is the search for Professor Style, and you can see it's all men in these three-piece suits. So this is all in Chapter 1, A Society Searching. And here she's showing what happens when you have stereotypes in the world, how are they reproduced, and how are they enacting new modes of stereotypes, new kinds of stereotypes in society when you have a search engine like Google. So why is this happening? Well, Safiya Noble says Google is a commercial enterprise, not a
neutral public service or information company, it doesn't just affect everyone equally. She says that this commercial bottom line is affecting marginalized people disproportionately, and that it is racist and sexist. So now this is really interesting because the public believes the top rank is the most popular and the most credible. In other words, when I do a search and the first thing comes up, I assume that it is the most popular and credible. That is the kind of information that I'm looking for. So she wants to know, why do you get porn when you have a keyword search that doesn't have the word porn in that search? What does it mean to be a commercial enterprise? Well, Google made $24.7 billion at the time she was writing this book, and their parent company Alphabet, which also is involved in kind of military operations and products and biomedicine and many other industries and fields, they made $649.49 billion at the time she was writing. So what she's saying here is, again, the main point. There is some missing social context in the commercial digital media platforms, and it matters. She also says, gets into this more later on, that racist, sexist text is not new, and you can see it in library classification systems. So it's historical, it's material, there is a profit motive, there is social domination, and it's political, it's economic. She talks about how a search doesn't yield info relevant and helpful, but it is a matrix of ways in which pages are hyperlinked and indexed on the web. So this means whatever is profitable, whatever serves the business interests of Google's partners, that is what they are going to list at the top of a search page. Google creates advertising algorithms, not information algorithms. A part of her work in this book too is she looks at the feminist critiques of advertising in print and how those apply to advertising online. In chapter 1, A Society Searching, she looks at the history of media in print and digital and how that is reproduced and extended through search engines like Google. One of the interesting things I didn't know about is actually how bibliometrics, she says, are built into the Google system, which is called PageRank, and it uses something called citation analysis. The problems with this when you are indexing and scraping the web for instances of a keyword is people sometimes abuse that, and they do something called Google bombing, which is just overloading a keyword on a page that's maybe not relevant, so it redirects users to that page. It also doesn't vet or examine or critically monitor the kinds of words and information that's going onto a page. It just sees the word, and no matter what context it's used in, if it's derogatory, positive, negative, if it's used to support an idea, to disclaim an idea, to discredit an idea, it doesn't matter how it's used, it just sees the word and then boom, that is how this bibliometric works. So I thought the way that this web scraping and indexing of links and words on the internet, this bibliometric and this citation analysis that is taken from the library sciences world, I thought that was really important and interesting for how Google works and understanding what's going on there. Another thing I thought was fascinating in this book is if you click or do not click the results page impacts future results. One of the interesting things with Google is its high trust with low accountability. So this is a kind of technology that you see in schools, libraries, and other places where you just expect to get the right information. And so there's this idea of high trust, low accountability. If something bad happens, there's an example in this book about what happens when you Google searched Jews, and Google issued a public statement about the math behind it and how it was a glitch in the system. They were working on it and they gave you some other ideas for keywords to search. Google kind of absolved themselves of any responsibility, and they said, basically it was not their fault, it's how people were using Google, and it's how they had built a system which they did not know was going to work out this certain way. And Safiya Noble pretty much just tears that all apart, and she does this by pointing out, well, if Google is not responsible, then who is? It's pretty much that simple. When you have something, a bad system, and Google built it, then, anyway. She talks about how Google changed some of the election results, and shows some data on how trusted Google is. So 73% of all Americans have used a search engine, 59% report using a search engine every day. So again, 73% reported that they would not be okay with a search engine keeping track of searches and using that information to personalize future search results. Participants reported that they feel this to be an invasion of privacy. So there's this idea of low accountability, high trust. Here I was thinking about the issue with representation and how it affects marginalized communities and people's life chances, and that is again something that was well documented. I think I have a sticky note for that later. She talks about 3 different studies and researchers who look at what actually happens in a scientific study when people are shown misrepresentations of people that are a part of their identity, and it leads to them feeling worse about themselves and forming also bad stereotypes and ideas about themselves. So Safiya again shows different search results when you search for Asian girls, Latina girls, black girls, and the results are pretty horrible, so I'm not going to show them. So another example of representation is when you search doctor, you'll see mostly men. When you search nurse, you'll see mostly women. And these people have different salaries, they have different career outcomes, different salary outcomes. That's not fair. Stereotypic images, she says, influence the redistribution of resources in ways that benefit the dominant groups at the expense of others. That's kind of the short end of it, and that comes from McCarthy. That was the researcher McCarthy. When she talks about the negative images that create adverse perceptions of blacks in society, she talked about Narissa, Thomas, and Yuki. And these are all different university scholars, professors, professionals, people in academia, people in the industry, and people who are doing this scientific investigation into representation and identity. One I found really interesting was specifically on TV. Narissa M. Punyantnut Carter, a communication scholar at Texas Tech University, has specifically researched media portrayals of African American societal roles, which confirms previous studies about the effects of negative media images on blacks on college. So what she's saying is search engine design is not only a technical matter, but a political one. And she says also the machine is turned to and positioned as a mere tool. When someone says just Google it, this is the idea that it's trusted and there's also no accountability. I think the whole point of this book is to have you question. It wants you to think that it's just a tool to be there to be helpful and relevant. In showing these snapshots of Google searches, she's showing you there are plenty of examples in researchers in this growing movement of scholars who are looking at the detrimental effects toward marginalized communities, towards black and female communities in technology, in algorithms, in Google search engines. So here she says, the more we can make transparent the political dimensions of technology, the more we might be able to intervene. Zoom out, my sticky notes are getting crazy. So I love bell hooks, and she is quoted here on page 102. Facing herself, the black female realizes all that she must struggle against to achieve self-actualization. She must counter the representations of herself, her body, her being as expendable. Woo, my goodness. Yeah. Here we are in chapter 3, Searching for People and Communities. The intro to this is really fascinating. She talks about June 17, 2015 in Charleston, South Carolina, where 21-year-old white nationalist Dylan Storm Roof opened fire on unsuspecting African-American Christian worshipers at Mother Emanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in one of the most heinous racial and religious crimes of recent memory. She demonstrates how, actually in a tweet that Dylan had tweeted out himself, he found bad information on Google, just this weird wormhole of disinformation that is meant to, it's not true and it's meant to deceive. Chapter Chapter 4 is searching for protections from search engines. This chapter I remember being about the right to be forgotten, and it looked at examples of teachers who had pornographic media online that was dredged up and it resurfaced, which caused these teachers to lose their jobs and be basically publicly humiliated and disowned by their family. I mean, the consequences were awful. They had lost their social standing completely and all they had worked toward in their careers, all for something that was a part of the past. And so this, I remember, was about the idea that search is power. So what we find online influences real people's lives and is permanent in a way that benefits Google and in many cases not the actual people or the users or the producers of the content on Google. So one of the other interesting examples out of this chapter was On Our Backs, which was I think a publication produced by lesbians, and it was about kind of like their feminist lesbian empowerment, and it was also pornographic. But the idea, and what's interesting, is that it was print. It was in the age of print. There was not a digital sphere for it to enter and circulate. So the way it circulated was very slow and it was very hand to hand. You had one limited number of copies of this pornographic magazine that had images of nude people who had other things in their lives going on. They weren't, they maybe didn't want their nude images to surface in the digital space. And so when things are digitized, there's that risk that it will be online forever. And this is kind of the idea in this chapter, searching for protections from search engines, that maybe not everything should be on Google. And Google is building this monopoly with information it gets from calendar, from maps, from a free email service, from search, all of the ways that it's just tracking your data and getting information about you, data mining. It's using all of that to understand and sell you to advertisers. And the more it can get, the more permanent it can be, the more prolific it can be, the more everywhere it can be, the more dangerous it is. Chapter 4 moves away from searching and into the future of knowledge in the public. This was really interesting because it had some bits about the history of search, and there's this great bit called A Short History of Misrepresentation and Classifying People, and there she references a lot of work by Hope A. Olson, who is the Associate Dean and Professor of, Information Science at, she's the Dean and Professor at the Science of Information at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and I thought this was very informative and impactful. She talks about something called the Library of Congress subject headings, and some of the original language for those subject headings, the way that, this authoritative framework for how things were referenced was racist. So for example, it would make people a question rather than saying this is their existence. It called into question their existence, and it delegitimized them as people, and it dehumanized them, which is crazy. One of the ways it did this was by calling, Jews, for example, the Jewish question, by calling Asians the yellow peril. And these were the terms that people used to find information in libraries all over the United States. At least that's what I understand. Would love if someone could add on if I missed something there. She also talks about how the Dewey Decimal System, which I've certainly come to know pretty well working in schools and having libraries that use Dewey Decimal, 80% of the religious section is for Christian texts. That just blows my mind. Chapter 6 is the future of information culture. I did take note of the supply chain for hardware. So companies like Apple and Dell, and how technologies are actually produced. I think that's really interesting. And I learned about coltane, which is columbite tantalite. And this is a mineral that is mined in the Democratic Republic of Congo and then bought by big companies like Nokia, Intel, Sony, and Ericsson, which is now Google. And these minerals are used to build microprocessor chips for computer hardware such as phones and computers. And so you have cheap labor, basically you're exploiting workers to build this hardware that is then sold out. And what happens on the hardware? You have Google and all of the other things Google produces, and you are misrepresenting and oppressing Black communities on Google, which again is happening on hardware. One of the things I found so upsetting was on page 167, and that was that the gap between Black and white wealth has become so acute that a recent report by Brandeis University found that this gap quadrupled between 1984 and 2007, making whites 5 times richer than Blacks in the US. The fact that this is getting larger, this gap, that it quadrupled within 30 years is super concerning. Okay, last chapter, conclusion of algorithms of oppression. Here we go. She proposes a new area of research, a new line of inquiry, she says, called Black Feminist Technology Studies. And I love that as an idea because it hits on this intersection of, what matters. You have all of these highly qualified, highly trained scholars and professionals in Asian studies, in gender studies, in race studies, in Black African American studies. And these people in the humanities and the social sciences are not working in the companies where these technologies are built. And so you can't expect engineers who are coming with computer science degrees to know the same kinds of things about representation and identity as these highly qualified, trained professionals and scholars. So in the conclusion, all of this leading up has been mostly about Google and what happens in a Google search engine. We looked at PageRank and the bibliometrics, how a search result happens, how Google is making billions of dollars protecting the economic and business interests of its partners by giving them a higher rank, by putting ads on the search results where people do not know there are ads, by positioning itself as this kind of clean, trusted interface. In this conclusion to algorithms of oppression, Safiya Noble talks about an interview with Candace, who is a hairdresser working in a privileged university town and cutting the hair of Black women mostly, it sounds like. She was the only Black hairdresser salon, and I think at the short end of the interview and this conversation that she had with this hairdresser, Noble is making the point that these technologies are designed to push certain people out. And the people who benefited from being on Yelp, the hairdressers that benefited, were white. And an example of this is that if you were close to the university and you were paying for Yelp as a service, you were put first in the rank. So your result would appear first. Even if you were, for example, a Black woman looking for a Black hairdresser, you would be taken to instead a paid business that's paid to be on Yelp, that could be run by white people. It could be a franchise with no connection to the community. And meanwhile, Candace had been there for many, many years, connecting, building roots, spreading through word of mouth. One of the problems that she said is actually people in the Black community, according to this hairdresser, use word of mouth almost exclusively, and they are not keen to put their information online or be seeking information or recommendations online. I'm sure that can't always be true, but according to Candace and where she lived and her hairdresser, her business, that was something that she saw, is this withering away of her business to the point where she actually wanted to close her shop and move on to something else. She just didn't know what she would do. She had no other options, she felt, so she was just losing money. And it's just ridiculous that it would send someone on a drive far away to this white run business instead of, if what you're looking for is someone who knows black hair, when you search black hair on Yelp, it would show you the color and not black hair, the texture. That was coming from Candace and Noble in their conversation, which gets into algorithms and how they are motivated by profit, how they advantage and disadvantage you depending on the color of your skin, and all of it is built into the system, so that's happening all the time. When it is like optimizing, it is getting deeper and deeper and more entrenched in the kinds of systematic decisions that the algorithm is making. It's getting better and better at pushing black people out and putting white people at the center. So pretty horrifying. Noble then talks about imagined alternatives to a public non-commercial search. And one of them was this highly customizable search where kind of like a gradient, and you could choose between like, a million different hex codes. You could see based on colors. In red might be pornographic, everything in green would be business or commerce, everything in orange would be entertainment, and so forth. So this is about creating transparency. Actually, one of the other things she talks about in this book is the way that libraries build their search engines. You can toggle different settings, you can prioritize different keywords, different fields, different publishers, different, years. It is a more complex system that you can interact with in a transparent way. Google just has a search bar, so you don't really know what you're getting, and you cannot control to the same degree the settings and get what you're looking for in the same way you can with, like, say, a library or a public institution, a journal, a database. She then talks about what happens when you search black girls now on Google and the kinds of incremental improvements that have been made since then. And then briefly in the epilogue, she talks about how fake news and disinformation was a turning point in the 2016 election, the defeat of Hillary Clinton and the rise of Donald Trump. All of this to say, when you look at the darn index and the references, there's 9 pages of references. So many people are behind this book. It's not just Safiya Noble, that have studied rigorously and tested against, and this is a book that brings it all together. And the argument is we should pay more attention and know how search engines work. So my closing thoughts are, this is an amazing book and it should be required reading for any person in the 21st century. I had no idea the kinds of dangers and pitfalls and histories behind Google search and algorithms in general, and just how destructive they are for specific communities, especially the black female communities, but as well anyone in a kind of identity group or affinity group or community that is the victim of a vulnerable population of a neoliberalist capitalist economy. She talks all about that much better than I could ever do justice. So I recommend this book to anyone. It is so important and opened my eyes to so many key issues and gave several examples. I'm walking away reading this book feeling like I'm more critical in my day-to-day of Google and just what exactly they're doing, how they're making their money. My understanding of the world is a little bit more complete and less naive than it was before. So I would absolutely recommend Algorithms of Oppression by Safiya Noble. Even if you're not in information science or computer science or some kind of tech or info field or humanities or whatever you're studying, everyone uses these technologies, and she's saying that's why it's important to know what goes into them, who is building them, what is their purpose. So do pick up this book. I got mine at my library, so find it wherever you can, ask your librarian, go talk to someone and say, hey, can I have this book? Especially if you're supporting a public institution like a library, that is definitely the way I would go about reading this book. So please do pick it up and let me know what you think. And also let me know what I should read next. I'm trying to read
many books before I start graduate school, so I will take your suggestion genuinely. Thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and leave me a comment. Let me know what you thought. Alright, thanks friends, and see you around for the next one.